I'd like to welcome everyone to this research panel hosted by ASPA section on democracy and social justice. My name is Sean McCandless, and I'm serving as chair from January 2020 until December of 2021. And this panel is one of a few we're hosting, given the understandable cancellation of ASPA 2020 in Anaheim. But before getting started, I'd like to let you know about just a few other DSJ-sponsored events you may be interested in. So in addition to the two panels we have, which we are going to be posting on our social media accounts for everyone to see, we hope that you're going to be able to join us for this event on Thursday, June 4th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we in DSJ are collaborating with NASPA's Diversity and Social Equity Committee to provide this webinar on promoting equity in and out of the classroom. As you can see here, we have a great lineup of panelists with a wealth of experience, and Prisa Vinzant, who's our wonderful social media editor, just sent you the RSVP link in the chat function. So if you haven't RSVP'd yet, please be sure to do so. Another thing that we in DSJ are doing, I'd like everyone to know about, is we're going to be offering a 6-part webinar series on ethics starting in September of 2020. We're still finalizing the schedule, but we're going to be talking about a lot of great topics, as you see here: ethics education, constitutional legal perspectives, and of course, social equity, diversity, and inclusion as ethical priorities, among other topics. So just keep an eye out on our social media and our section communications for more. So a bit more about today. For wiggle room, we do have until 3 p.m. Eastern time. After some quick introductions, we're going to have 4 great presentations lasting, roughly 10 to 15 minutes each, give or take. And this will be followed by Q&A, and our Prisa will be helping me with keeping an eye on the questions. We are recording this event and we'll post it on our social media and our newsletter. So if you'd like to ask a question, which I hope you do, please feel free to use the chat function. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question, just indicate in the chat that you'd like to be unmuted, and we can go ahead and take care of that for you. And you could probably see right now, you probably can't self-unmute because just given the prevalence of Zoom bombing, we're trying to keep things as open yet as safe as possible. And I'm going to be staying off camera just to make the editing for social media just a tad easier. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have a great lineup today. We're privileged to be joined by Dr. Greggory Johnson of the University of San Francisco, who'll be talking about invisible populations in the Me Too movement. Also by Dr. Lorenda Naylor of the University of Baltimore, talking about social justice and LGBTQ persons. Also Dr. Masami Nishishiba of Portland State University, who'll be discussing addressing equity and empowering underrepresented employees. And also Dr. Kris Norman-Major of Hamline University, who'll be discussing revisiting the 4 E's, or have we achieved equity for social equity in public administration. And we're going to go ahead and follow this order, followed by Q&A. I'll be managing the slides, so whenever the speakers need to have slides advanced, just say, next slide, please, or something. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Johnson. I think you're still on mute, Dr. Johnson.
Okay.
There we go.
How's that? Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McCandless. I bring you all greetings from the University of San Francisco. Would very much like to thank Dr. McCandless for organizing this panel and his great leadership with DSJ. And also want to acknowledge my dear colleagues who are on the panel with me today. It is always a pleasure when I can be in association with them on a panel or a publication or whatever. We have many years of doing that. And just finally, I want to make sure that I acknowledge the San Francisco chapter of ASPA. I see that my chapter president is on the line, Dr. Mick McGee, and I'm certainly glad to have him, and to any other members of the San Francisco chapter as well. So now I will begin with my presentation, and Dr. McCandless, if you can advance that, please. So basically, what I'm going to be discussing today, just briefly, is some research that I have coming out in a publication with another colleague. And I'll start off by suggesting that as a social equity scholar, part of what I research is it deals with social movements, because as one could imagine, this country specifically has never given anyone anything without a great deal of perseverance. And here I'm speaking about marginalized groups, right? So, for example, if we trace the social movements back, to the abolitionist movement, the women's suffragette movement, the labor movement, all of these things, and certainly the LGBT movement. My dear friend and colleague, Dr. Naylor will be addressing some of that in her presentation, and we are here as a society now because of all of these movements. Now, specifically, I'm concerned with what we consider contemporary uh, movements by Beck as defined by Becker, right? So those movements that have certainly been within the latter half of the the 20th, the 19th century, 20th century, so forth, you know, until now. So um, I think that and research bears this out, without social movements, there will be little rights for, again, people that are in marginalized communities. Uh, Dr. McCandless, if you could advance, please. Thank you. So most of this is in just an overview um, for a lot of you, because certainly the panelists are all aware of the history of social equity, which was started primarily by uh, Philip Rutledge, who has passed away several years ago, and George Ferguson, who is currently still at the University of Kansas, enjoying a long and fruitful career in public administration. But certainly, one could speculate whether or not Dr. Rutledge and Dr. Frederickson were influenced by the signs of the time, right? This would have been during the mid '60s or so, when the civil rights movement was going on. Again, those contemporary social movements, the LGBT movement, the women's rights movement, and so forth. So there's no clear indication as to whether or not they were influenced. One could speculate that they were, and regardless of how they got to where they got to in that place of consciousness, um, social equity evolved. And two big events that happened during this time, of course, was the Middlebrook events, which were conferences within public administration that dealt specifically with the issues of the day, the social equity issues of the day. And one of the things that's not on the slide is that I actually participated in Middlebrook. It was called Middlebrook 3. And that was during, I believe it was during the mid 2000s, like 2003, 2004, in upstate New York. And again, it was a terrific conference. I always think to myself, if that conference was amazing, I could imagine what the Middlebrook conferences of 1968 and also 1988 were like. Just very explosive, a lot of energy, a lot of moving forward. So, so we're grateful to have uh, those events as part of our um, repertoire of thinking through social equity. Professor McCandless, if you could advance, please. Now, specifically, the purpose of the paper that I did with my colleague was to address the Me Too movement, right? And really how that becomes an ethical issue for public administration specifically. And as we all know, the primary purpose of the Me Too movement was to present and create opportunities for women to tell their stories of sexual abuse and other forms of abuse. Period. And so from that standpoint, I'm sure we would all agree that it is it is a powerful movement, though there is quite a bit of disagreement in the literature on this particular movement by women uh, who wonder if, in fact, these stories coming out need to really be coming out. It's kind of like when I was uh, growing up in New York City many years ago, and I told my mother one day as I was preparing for college that I was thinking of a political career, and she says to me, "Don't you dare," because everyone would find out all of our family secrets. And so, kind of the same thing with the some women in the Me Too movement. So, um, and then of course, the real I believe the real angst of this movement was that um, what we do know certainly is that Black and Brown women have been reporting on these issues for decades, right? They've been, we're talking about like the chambermaids and other sort of working class women, uh, white, Black, brown, and et cetera. They've been trying to get their voices heard. Certainly, if you look at this topic in the literature, what you'll find over and over again um, are the sexual abuses that happen specifically in hotel rooms, whereby the chambermaid lady goes to the hotel room to bring food or clean the room or whatever, and there's the guy in there who comes to the door, naked and propositioning her, right? And so the literature is replete with those types of pieces of information. But again, as what we do know is that uh, this information, like the movement, could have advanced so much more further had it been taken seriously several years ago. So Tarana Burke is the person that actually coined the term Me Too, right? And specifically, that came about because she was uh, speaking with a young African American teenager, a female, who was recounting her experiences of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And Tawana said, "Me too." And so that started her to talk with other women about this. And this is how the term Me Too um, was coined, right? And what I think is empowering in that moment is that, not trying to seek fame or anything, Tawana Burke was able to, even with her limited exposure, um, to get this to come to the forefront. But what we do know is that it wasn't acceptable. It wasn't accepted as a truth until celebrities, specifically Caucasian women with well-resourced and, of course, with names, brought this to the table. And this is when people started thinking, oh, there's something to the Me Too movement. Well, actually, there was something to the Me Too movement, you know, many, many years before that, but people were not being heard. Uh, Professor McCallum, if you could advance, please. Thank you. So perhaps the poster child for this of not being heard is Anita Hill, right? And those of you, those of us who are of a certain age, and I won't say what age that is, but those many of us remember what was going on with the Anita Hill uh, Clarence Thomas hearings, and it was I can remember being in San Francisco on Van Ness Street, which is a major thoroughfare in the city, and there was this at that time there was a large uh, sort of electronics store with televisions in the window, and I can remember, like literally like tens and tens of people in front of this window looking at this hearing because it was so explosive. And um, and so I say that, and I argue that Anita Hill is the poster child for not being heard, because despite the fact that this woman had a law degree from Yale, and was very savvy, spoke very well, she was not listened to. And of course, we all know the outcome of that situation. Clarence Thomas did go on to become to be vetted on the Supreme Court. Now, what's interesting is that years later, when asked about it, Joe Biden, who was involved with the situation, um, said he apologized to Anita Hill for having not believed her, essentially, and she basically did not want to take his apology. Well, you know, I do believe in forgiveness, but at the same time, I believe in forgiveness at your at the person's the victim's own time, not because it is the politically correct thing to do. So so Anita Hill, all these years later, is still talking about this situation, right? So let me go on because I know that I'm running out of time, but I want to say very clearly that if the Me Too movement is going to go forward, then it needs to be more inclusive, right? And I think that it really is a turnoff to a lot of women of color, working class women, because they don't see themselves represented in the movement. And also, there's a lack of others that could be in the movement: transgender people, non-conforming people, non-binary people, even men. And that may be a radical notion, but you know, men are not immune to being sexually harassed in the workplace, and whether that's same sex or opposite sex, it does still happen. So therefore, it would be uh, it would behoove the organizers of that organization, which of course I support, but they've got to do something to make sure that they pull in different individuals, regardless of who the individual is. Pain is pain and hurt is hurt. So therefore, it has got to be a more inclusive um, organization. And just finally, I think what we'll note is that since a number of the high-profile individuals have come down, who have been brought down, we're not hearing a great deal about the movement. And that's not to say that it's not existing any longer. However, it is to suggest that they will need to, if the Me Too movement is going to still be relevant, then they will need to again do the types of things that an organization needs to stay in place and do the substantive work that it needs to do. But it can't do this work, it can't stay relevant if it doesn't become more inclusive with the people that they're trying to advocate for. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. There's Dr. Johnson's contact information there, which we can also share again at the end. And with that, I would like to move over to Dr. Lorenda Naylor.
Panel. It's greatly appreciated and allows us to practice social distancing. I know a lot of people are hurting out there, and my heart goes out to everybody with the unemployment and health issues. So I'm hoping we can all navigate this together. Again, so many things. I want to talk today about, if you want to go into about 3 slides, Dr. McCandless, forward. I want to talk to you about the intersection of LGBTQ and public policy. And really, in some ways, pick up where Dr. Johnson had left off. And I want to talk specifically about legal rights within the LGBTQ community. And the reason is, if we're going to have the power of enforcement and the power for sustainability, it has to be based on values within the field. And it also has to be based on legal rights, whether that be through federal legislation, state and local legislation, and also through Supreme Court cases. So those have to come together collectively, I believe, in order to sustain the movement and make further advances. Next slide, please. And the reason this is critical, if we go back to the role and purpose of public policy, determining who gets what, when, and where. When I spoke at the last ASPA conference, I really focused on political boundaries, funding, and resources, because the U.S. Census is so important in capturing data and information, because it determines in large part who gets money. And what I'm interested in is how much money is allocated to LGBTQ when it comes to violence prevention and home ownership and education and credit and reducing homelessness, the things that are needed to support and provide equality or equal status for the community. Next slide, please. And I talked about this being a part of the field. We all know, if you go back to the definition of NAPA, the National Academy of Public Administration, they talk about social equity, promoting fairness, justice, in the formation of public policy. So we have deep roots in the field of public administration. And also, if you go into and looking at the ASPA Code of Ethics, who is our sponsor today and host with our section, our principle 4 states that, you know, this is about treating all people with fairness, justice, and equality. So I believe the social equity as a value is here. What I'm trying to do in my research is to strongly connect and to link it to the rule of law, to make sure it is tightly connected to a legal foundation. And if we look at the legal advancements, next slide, please. Dr. Johnson had mentioned movements, and one of the biggest movements, of course, started with the Stonewall riots in the late 1960s. And that occurred, and that basically ignited the gay movement across the country. You had these large grassroots organizations, you had people in local levels working to secure rights and equal status for LGBTQ community. And I just want to sum up in the next slide. Dr. McCandless, thank you. And the next slide here. If you look at some of the major legal advances, of course, the 2015 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, we have the guarantee of marriage equality. And with that, which is equally important, is federal spousal benefits across the whole entire country. A second ruling came out in 2013, which changed the definition of marriage. Prior to this, there was a federal law known as DOMA that had described and defined marriage between a man and a woman. The U.S. Supreme Court came out and said that in the 13, I believe it was the 13 states and also the District of Columbia at the time, that would change because they had legalized same-sex marriage. And that also those individual same-sex married couples would receive federal spousal benefits. In 2011, that is where gays could openly serve in the military. We had the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And again, you're talking about major cultural shifts occurring across the country. Next slide, please. In 2009, we have protection in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, protected classes within hate crimes, and that was through the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Act. And probably the most significant, which laid the foundation for a lot of future U.S. Supreme Court rulings, actually came in the Lawrence versus Texas case in 2003. And in that case is where same-sex couples were guaranteed a right to sexual privacy. That case was absolutely instrumental because it was about treating people equally. The next slide I want to talk about, so you have legal advances taking place, and that is significant. And another venue, if we look at, is political representation. Great strides have also been made with political representation. Right now, or as you have seen in the presidential election, the first time in U.S. history in terms of a primary, we had an openly gay candidate that took place, and this was just monumentous. We also had 9 U.S. members of Congress who are openly LGBTQ. We have 2 openly gay governors, Jared Polis in Colorado, as well as Kate Brown. Oops. In Oregon. There are 22 openly LGBTQ officials serving in state legislatures. And of course, Virginia had elected the first transgender, Danica Rome. And then we also have a mayor in Chicago, 2019, Lori Lightfoot. And my point in mentioning that is I believe great strides have been made. A lot of advances have been made. But I think and that goes back, to a movement and talking about the power of movements that Dr. Johnson had just mentioned. But much work needs to be done in order to secure equal status and equal rights. We continue to have a lot of bias and discrimination and a lot of harassment to the point where LGBTQ citizens are treated like second-class citizens. There is a wide range. We look at hate crimes or just hate in general, from discrimination to bullying to assault and murder. And I believe if we look back in 2016, we saw 49, if this was at the Orlando nightclub, 49 people were massacred and another over 50 people were actually hurt. And that was a Latino gay bar. There's in the FBI reports, 20% of hate crimes are due to sexual orientation and gender identity. So we need to do more to protect people and to ensure their safety. And if you go to the next slide, please. The other thing, and the good news here, is this is measurable, and this is the outcome disparities. Dr. McCandless, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I had to turn my phone off. In terms of outcome disparities, we know that LGBTQ individuals have higher rates of abuse, rape, victimization, addiction when it comes to drug and alcohols, health and medical problems, homelessness and unemployment, as well as mental health issues. And we need to start tracking that so we can look at trend data over time to ensure that we provide support and interventions, and also to measure it and make sure we're closing those gaps. Next slide, please. So the next steps where I see legal advances occurring are going to be in federal employment rights, also in federal adoption and foster care. We have a real big issue right now in the United States, and actually it's been going on for decades. We have roughly 500,000 children that need homes, that are in foster care, and if they don't get homes, they age out of the system. And we need to ensure that LGBTQ individuals and families and couples who want to adopt are allowed to adopt and given due process like everybody else. And also we can help move kids out of foster care, so that they have adults and loving families to grow up in. And the other area is simply protecting transgenders. In the 90s and also 2000, we had this slew of bathroom bills that took place at state legislatures. But I think the bigger issue is, how do we protect people on a day-to-day business, whether they're going to the grocery store, they're going to the gym. What can we do to ensure their safety so that they are not violated or attacked simply based on gender identity or sexual orientation? So that is what my research is on, and that's what it's about. And what I really want to start looking at is delving into measurable outcomes. Next slide, please. And this goes back to work that was pointed out by Savara and Brunette, and also NAPA. This is procedural fairness, distributional equity, process equity, and outcome disparities. In other words, tracking federal legislation, tracking the funding, and also connecting the goals and objectives so that we can measure outcomes to see over time, are people better off? Are LGBTQ people better off at the end of the day because of the federal legislation? Is it in fact effective? So that is my research and what I'm working on, and I will turn it back over to Dr. McCandless. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Naylor, and I apologize that some of the slides took a second or two to advance. Takes Zoom a little bit to wake up a little bit at times, but I'll make sure to have that edited in for the recording. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Nishishiba.
Thank you, Dr. McCandless. Also, I would like to thank everybody here today to join us. It's nice to see people. Also, thanks for the SJ for organizing this panel. So can I go to the next slide, please? So the presentation that I am going to do today is a case study of a fire and rescue department in Pacific Northwest. And for the purpose of the confidentiality, I'm going to use the pseudonym and refer to them as FRVP. So as you know, fire service workforce traditionally has been very much white male dominated. We are seeing more entrance of firefighters with a background, people of color, and more female firefighters, but it is still a very white male dominant environment. So this FRVP had a new chief. And he contacted us to do a cultural assessment study, and this is what I am going to report about today. I also have been following up with FRVP so I can report a little bit on what actions they have been taking after we submitted the cultural assessment study. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the chief. The new chief who commissioned this study to us, and I'm again going to use the pseudonym Chief Andrew. And so he was about 6 months into the job. So he was fairly new when he commissioned this study. He is a white male, has been serving as the chief elsewhere. And as you can tell, he started this initiative fairly early in his career. And so it kind of shows how much commitment he had in terms of looking at diversity and inclusion. And so when we met with him, he said, you know, addressing the issue of diversity and making this department an inclusive one is very, very important for me. But I don't know much about this work. He said, I'm a firefighter. I don't know about diversity and inclusion, and that's why we need your help. And he says, do the study, tell us what we should do, and we will work with it. And so I was very impressed with his candor and the openness, and also the willingness to listen to others to make the changes. And also, right after he hired us, he appointed 2 members of the key leadership and created a team that represents FRVP for this study in doing a cultural assessment study. So we work with a team of FRVP firefighters, management, and some of the non-sworn staff. The chief also started to attend their equity committee meetings. He was very persuasive about needing to get the buy-in from the whole organization so we can have a good participation in this cultural assessment study. He even made a video and sent out the video saying that this study is coming. I need everybody to participate. Also, currently, FRVP was having a female firefighters kind of a breakfast meeting, and so he was consistently attending those female firefighters' breakfasts to get their perspective. I don't know the details, but I was also informed that he was dealing with some kind of a personnel disciplinary issue with the unions, and that had some origin in some of the incidents that is related to diversity and inclusion type of topics. Next slide, please. So for the study, together with the leadership team and the equity committee, we identified the approach. We decided that we will do leadership interviews, 18 members of the leadership. We organized 5 focus group discussions, and we did that in a variety of different ways. Some with a subgroup, like a women firefighter only focus group, or African American firefighters, but also we had some mixed focus groups too. We administered the online survey, and then we also reviewed their policies, and we looked into other promising practice research. Next slide, please. So the actual report has a lot of information, which is too much to share everything. But I wanted to share a very high-level kind of assessment that we made about this FRVP kind of culture in relation to making changes for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we identified there are some kind of a driving force type of culture in FRVP. So one, as I have been elaborating, there is a very strong commitment to promote diversity and inclusion from the chief, and also from a very committed group of people in the equity committee and such. So many people identify that they are committed to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they think it is important. Also, the nature of the fire service is very community-oriented. Community members love firefighters. The firefighters really want to help the community, and recognizing that the community is getting more diverse, that was becoming more and more of a motivation for the organization and the organizational members to try to make changes in their organization to promote diversity and inclusion. This new chief, his slogan was being bold. He encouraged people to be bold. He said, risk-taking is important, be bold. And this encouraged many people who have not been voicing their concern to step up and kind of bring the issue to the table, particularly in relation to promoting diversity and inclusion. So we saw those as a very good driving force, a very strong driving force for FRVP to make changes. However, we also identify some restraining forces that is underlying their culture. And those are the cultural components that may be good for doing the fire services, but some of that may be a restraining factor in their desire to make changes in relation to diversity and inclusion. I will kind of go over those quickly and then elaborate a little bit more in the next 2 slides. So, sorry, please go back. Thank you. So the restraining forces, one, their sort of expectations to maintain the high professional standard. And that is a good thing for an organization, but it seems to have some clash with the commitment to DEI. The other one, about the very strong cultural orientation in the fire service, is that they are very cohesive group. The firefighters live in the station, they sleep at the station, they eat together, they literally work like a family members. And they love it, and that is an important aspect of being a fire service, but we also identify that that can also counter the desire to make changes in DEI. And then being bold, we realize that that can be a double-sword edge. It can work for the changes, but it can also become a constraining force for the changes. So let me explain more about the restraining forces in the next 2 slides. So next slide, please. And so the commitment to DEI. So there is a commitment to DEI, but as I mentioned, that the firefighters and the people we interview and talk at the focus group, they all emphasize that it is very important to maintain the highest standard. As you can see in those quotes, people emphasize that and say we shouldn't be lowering the standard to meet equality or to try to diversify the organization. And they noted that in the past, in an attempt to try to hire more women or attempt to try to hire more people of color, they thought that their standards were lowered. Or some people really say that in a way it is a colorblind kind of notion, saying that it doesn't matter what the background is, everybody has a same standard to comply with, and as long as they are meeting the standard, that's most important. However, some people started to think about those implications of those professional standards and saying that, yeah, I mean, we don't have to lower the standard to do the job, but when the physical exam put above extreme kind of standard that doesn't even require for the job, why should we? So when the job only requires to be able to lift 60 pounds, why do we have to sort of require people to be able to show that they can lift 600 pounds? It's extreme analogy, but they noted that some of the physical test standards have that kind of element. Okay, next slide, please. And then the family-like cohesiveness. So again, as I mentioned, it is a very good thing. However, for people who are new to the organization or new to the station, it can make people feel alienated. And so this is a quote from female firefighters who happen to be in a station where she is the only female firefighter. And she said, I was an outsider because I was a female. And not that she was being treated badly or anything, but she always felt like she is not part of that family, and people seems to not know how to interact with her. So she was feeling alienated in the station. And the flip side of that is there is a tremendous pressure to conform to the station culture. And this is not only for female firefighters or firefighters who are people of color, but also for the new male firefighters, but they all want to conform. But the pressure seems to be higher for women and minorities. And then the third one, so because it is like a family-like atmosphere, people want to kind of lower the guard and act in a very casual way while they are in the station, and they banter. And so they said this family-like cohesiveness sometimes promote people, allow people to engage in an inappropriate behavior, say very inappropriate jokes that can be a microaggressive type of comments. And so that was identified as a major issue in terms of trying to create an inclusive work culture. Next slide, please. Okay. Can you, yeah. So the third thing is being bold. As I mentioned, the being by the chief promoting people to be involved, more people started to step up. But it also backlash, and sometimes they experience retribution. And so person who took and initiated the report. Some concerns ended up taking the brief and the heat, and sometimes they again become alienated. In the survey, about 46% of the people said that I've experienced resistance when I suggest new ideas for improving our organization. So being bold kind of created those tensions. Next slide, please. So those are the very high level kind of results that I'm just presenting, but we presented the whole report, and it was posted on the website, shared by the Equity Committee, and they really took it seriously. And after we submitted the report, several actions were taken. One, they have been already doing it, but they reviewed the testing procedure, and I don't know the details on this, but I was informed that they made some changes. So it is not requiring an excessive physical test above and beyond what they need for the actual job. Also, they reviewed some HR policies and made changes. And one thing I know, in the promotion test, in the interview, they required the candidates to be promoted to read this cultural assessment report. And they have been asked what they think about how they can kind of move the organization forward in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They created equity manager position and hired openly lesbian female civilian. They also made the process of appointing equity committee more transparent and expanded the membership. They actively started to engage the equity committee in recruiting new firefighters. They are in the process of finalizing the equity plan, and I am also working with them still. The equity manager is now developed some training material, and she is going to go around the station and deliver the training. And then organizationally, I was disappointed that Chief Andrew, the very first person that I mentioned, resigned from the position. However, the good thing was that the Assistant Chief Baker, another pseudonym, was appointed as the interim chief, and he was one of the leadership team members who developed the cultural studies. So he was very, very aware of what's going on, and he carried on all those changes. And now they have an African American female chief appointed as the leadership. So I felt like those are a good kind of example on how the organization is making some changes around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm hoping to tease out some of the essences from this case study so we can kind of use that as a best practice guide for other fire service organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nishishiba. And with that, we'll turn it over to our final presentation with Dr. Norman-Major.
Thanks, Dr. McCandless, and thanks to all of my colleagues who presented beforehand. That really sets a nice context for this presentation, looking at revisiting the 4 E's, or have we achieved equity for social equity in public administration. If you can go to the next slide. So just a little bit of history. I wrote an article back in spring of 2011 for actually a colloquium and JPay that Ricardo was organizing on social equity, asking the question, balancing the 4 E's, can we achieve equity for social equity? And given that it's been almost 10 years, I thought it was time to look at this again. So next slide, please. Just a little bit of history, and this is not an ego trip for me. This is just kind of an indicator of why I decided it was time to look at this again. So, as I mentioned, it's been almost 10 years. It's probably been 10 years since I started writing the article, given the timeline for publication. I found out a few years ago that it is the 4th most downloaded article from JPay. I was at a social equity leadership conference, and one of the faculty from University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire came up to me and said, you know, we require our applicants to write an essay about the 4 E's for their applications, and when they ask questions, we give them your article. Several times graduate students have stopped me at conferences and said they've appreciated the article. And I have to say, this is one of those things where I don't know about the rest of you academics that might be on the line, but you know, you write an article, you get it published, and it kind of goes on the shelf and you don't think about it anymore. That check is done for the year. So it was just kind of a reminder to me that people are actually looking at this and paying attention, and maybe it was time to go and see, has really social equity become a standard of practice as opposed to a stand of courage, which was one of the claims that the original article made. So next slide. I'm going to do this real quickly because I'm sure I'm probably preaching to the choir here, and most of you are very familiar with all of this. But the original article looked at the 4 pillars of public administration: economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and then equity. So next slide. And when you look at the history of public administration as a field and the development of the pillars of public administration, you'll know that there are originally 3 E's, or 3 things that we really focused on: economy, or basically getting the biggest bang for the taxpayer's dollar; efficiency, which is you know, getting the most, the best, the most preferable public service for the available resources; maximizing the total value to members of society from those scarce resources. So you have both sort of that procedural and economic definition of efficiency, and then effectiveness, which is, you know, are we doing what we set out to do? And that was really the initial emphasis of the study of public administration. Next slide. So as has been noted several times in the previous presentations here, that the 4th pillar of social equity really starts to come in with the 1968 Minnebrück Conference and George Frederickson raising questions about the need to take on questions of social equity and talking about efficiency for whom, economy for whom, effectiveness for whom, when we look at that. And then that work, as Dr. Johnson noted, of Philip Rutledge, and the development of the Standing Panel on Social Equity as part of NAPA in 2000, which came up with the definition listed here, and it has been in other presentations already today as well, but really looking at all sorts of aspects of social equity. And in part, this has been a critique of the social equity movement, is that I'm just going to say it, this definition was clearly written by a committee, because it's got a whole lot of semicolons and ors and ands, and it's hard to measure when we have such complex definitions of equity. So for my article back in 2011, I decided to simplify the definition of social equity to simple fairness and equal treatment when we look at systems, the distribution of resources to reduce inequalities in universal programs and services, and the redistribution of resources to level the playing field through targeted programs. So I really tried to narrow down looking at social equity from those perspectives. Next slide. And again, all of you have seen this, but I'll just reiterate real quickly when we talk about the difference between equality, everybody getting the same thing regardless of needs, and equity, people getting resources to accommodate differing needs. And if we get down to our goals in the long term, moving to inclusion, so we are also getting inclusion along with the equity, and not just raising the playing field, but maybe not getting equal participation. Next slide. So that gets me back to the original question. Have we achieved equity for social equity in public administration? And how will we know? I think panels like this raise that question for me: is this really still just a conversation among scholars, that we are promoting social equity and feel it should be important in the practice of public administration? Or are we really making, over the last 10 years and beyond, have we been making a difference in those that we educate, in the public servants, so that we are actually making policies and implementing programs that address questions of social equity, and it gets equal consideration along with efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. Next slide. So, you know, these slides are much bigger on a big screen. I should have made the printing bigger, so I apologize for that. So my initial considerations when I wrote the article, I focused on 3 different areas of social equity. The first was definitions, which I've already talked about in some manner, that there's questions of, were there too few, were they too complex, or were there too many definitions of social equity? And so again, I went back to those 3 areas that I focused on that were back a few slides ago. The next question was measures. How do we measure social equity? How do we know when it's happened? And at that time, there were several studies that were starting to look at social return on investment, particularly around areas of early childhood education, and a lot of the work that came out of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank and other groups that were starting to look at how do we actually measure social equity in some way or another, getting that social return on investment for our programs. And I wrote an article with Blue Woldridge looking at that. That's in the Johnson book on social equity. And then also some cost-benefit analysis work. And then my third question was curriculum. How are we educating courageous public administrators about social equity across the curriculum, looking at these questions? So those are the 3 things I focused on originally back in 2011. And so my work now is trying to revisit those areas and seeing how we're doing. So start that, moving on to the next slide. So we are starting in the areas of curriculum to get more work published that focuses on social equity in public administration. So you'll see here just a few examples. The PA Times came out with a special supplement focusing specifically on social equity and in the education sector. We had another conference looking at those big questions, kind of following up on Minnowbrook, looking at those big questions of public administration, of which social equity was a major category. We have this new book that Dr. McCandless is one of the co-editors on, Achieving Social Equity. So there are things coming out and materials and attention being paid to questions of social equity in the curriculum. Next slide. The other thing is that we are paying attention to social equity in our conferences and our programs. So before COVID came along and canceled all of our different events, and including ASPA, there were plans, more and more, the ASPA and NASPA and other conferences have been including social equity as a track in their conference planning. There was the Social Equity and Diversity Inclusion Workshop at ASPA. The Social Equity Leadership Conference, I believe, would have had its 20th year this summer, or it's been going on for quite a while, so that is another sign. And then we are also getting master's programs like this one here at Cincinnati that are focusing on these questions of social justice and social equity. So there is a continuing momentum on the curriculum side. But again, it gets to that question of, so have we just increased the conversation among scholars? Are we just talking about it more amongst us? And are we really having an impact and making a difference in the practice of public administration? Which gets me to the next slide. So looking now at the next area that I focused on in the article, which are measures. Are there more studies that are looking at social return on investment or cost benefit analysis or other measures that take a look at social equity and allow us to be able to measure whether or not we are being successful in the actual practice of bringing social equity to the table when we are making policies and implementing programs? So there have been a few articles that I found that are starting to do this and trying to increase looking at measures of social equity and how do we actually measure them. So there is the article by Glazier et al. In 2012 that looks at applying social equity in certain cases and creates measurements. In that article, there are two 2017 studies that came out for the Center for Applied Research and NAPA, both looking at different aspects of measuring social equity. The Linking Social Equity and Performance Measurement, a Practitioner's Guide, includes some possible measures and some actual case studies of programs that are focused around social equity. And then moving from theory to practice and evaluative assessment of social equity and approaches also includes some discussion about definitions and trying to simplify definitions, creating measures, and other resources around social equity. So we are getting some more movement around building measures of social equity. And as Lori pointed out in her presentation, really trying to get to the more of those measurable outcomes as we are moving forward. Next slide. So the other questions again, currently then, so I did curriculum and measurements, looking at definitions. Part of my continued work, and I haven't been able to dig into this quite as far as I want to yet, but looking at how are we defining social equity? How is it being defined in articles, in books, and in textbooks? And for that matter, is it even being discussed in textbooks? Doing a review of how much attention the pillars of public administration and discussions of social equity get in our textbooks on general public administration. Are we being consistent in how we're defining it? And what are all the different types of equity that we talk about? So that's been in several presentations already today about procedural fairness and access and equity and efficiency and all of those kinds of things. But my big question that I'm really trying to get at, and would take any suggestions, clearly the work that my colleagues presented today are some examples of how we're starting to get at this and looking at examples specifically of social equity in action, but if social equity is really going to become a standard of practice, or if it is a standard of practice, and we need to figure that out, and not just a courageous stand by public administrators who we feel are enlightened, we really only achieve equity for social equity if it's taken into consideration with the other 3 E's in policy development and implementation. And so getting to that, how do we measure equity in practice? What makes a policy or program social equity focused? So clearly not every policy or program is going to use the word social equity in its title or even in its description. And so how do we create some kind of measurements that allow us to assess different programs and policies for social equity components, whether or not they're taking those kinds of questions into consideration? I know there's the organization GARE, the government group working on racial equity, which is one group that's starting to do some more work on this. There's lots of other policies that clearly have social equity components to them. And so my goal is to try to figure out some ways that we can actually look at the practice of social equity and making sure that we are achieving equity for social equity when we are developing programs and policies and looking at how equity issues play in along with efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. So thank you. That is basically it. You can go to the next slide, which is basically just thanks and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Norman-Major, and thanks to all of you for these really interesting presentations. At this time, we'd like to invite questions and comments. You can use the chat function to ask a question. If you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question or make a comment, just please indicate so in the chat function and we can go ahead and unmute you. Parisa will be helping keeping an eye on the chat, but while we wait for questions and comments to come in, I have a question for all 4 of you. And I want to contextualize by saying that I think I'd be remiss not to mention the vast issues, especially on democracy and social justice, that it's being caused by COVID-19. And I'm thinking about the vulnerable populations that Dr. Johnson and Dr. Naylor mentioned. I think about vulnerable populations in workforce, especially emergency services that Dr. Nishishiba talked about. And I think about these broad questions about social equity, especially how we teach social equity, from Dr. Norman-Major. So with that context in mind, given the topics you have discussed today, how have you seen COVID affect, or how do you think it may affect the populations and issues you note? And what should be the response from the field of public administration?
Well, I'll start if you don't mind.
No, please.
I think clearly this situation has raised a lot of questions around social equity. I mean, we're opening up the economy again on the backs of low-wage workers and all of the challenges that have come up in some of those situations, and raising questions about healthcare and how that's paid for. I honestly am hopeful, and I know this sounds weird, but I am hopeful that the awareness of these social equity issues is becoming clearer, so that when we move out of this time and dealing with the immediacy of the crisis, that we will be in a better position to have the conversations about social equity, because more people are aware of the inequities at this point.
I agree with Dr. Norman-Major. This is it's a challenging situation, particularly for me personally, as most of you know on the panel. I lost 3 relatives to the pandemic: my father and 2 maternal aunts. So there's a sort of visceral reaction that I am having right now to our field as it relates to public as it relates to the pandemic. And certainly, I think that, I mean, like Kris just said, I mean, I'm hopeful that we will see our way through, and public administration will have a role to play with that. But I think certainly what this pandemic is showing us are the systemic inequities in the society, in societies generally, but certainly in the United States, with the lack of access to health care and other resources that so many vulnerable populations they lack the resources for testing. They lack the resources for hospitals. Just all of this stuff compounds, and you know, I'm sure everybody's heard this latest statistic that like 76% or so of Black and Brown people in the country, particularly African Americans, make up the deaths, all the deaths of COVID. So I think it's a very stinging situation, and is one that we would be wise as a field to pay attention to. And I believe that a number of us are. We're seeing a number of publications that are starting to come out on this, panels and so forth and so forth. But there's a great deal of work to be done, because again, we're dealing with systemic issues here that need to be overturned. So.
Thank you. I would like to add and certainly echo what Dr. Johnson and Dr. Kris Norman-Major had just said. And I think it's systemic, and in highlighting inequities and disparities, you see it in health outcomes and you see it in economic outcomes. And when it comes to the economic part, we see that at universities. And we see that in public schools, whether or not certain kids have laptops or what districts do and what they don't. We see it across manufacturing and plants, what organizations are shutting down, who is more at risk. And you see that across food processing and certainly emergency preparedness, all those groups who have a greater risk. And as well as what Dr. Johnson had just mentioned with race and age and underlying conditions. So I think it highlights that, and I think the challenge is, where do we go from here? Within the field of public administration and certainly across other disciplines, we have known about these inequities and inequalities, and they have existed for some time. And where do we go from here? Because I think one thing COVID-19 has showed us is that we're all in this together. And how do we move the country forward in ensuring that people are protected from future pandemics, but also that we mitigate this so that we can all get through this. Those would be my remarks on that.
I also agree with what everybody said, especially I'm seeing the impact of people's kind of awareness raised up in social equity. I'm teaching a class right now, and it is about the diversity, inclusion, and equity. And from the very beginning of the class, the students just see it. It usually took me a couple of weeks for people to kind of get the concept, but I was amazed how quickly people got it, because they actually see it, or they are seeing it. And so definitely the level of awareness is heightened, but also at the same time, I'm a little concerned that the students are feeling a little powerless right now, because they felt like they don't know what they can do. So as Dr. Naylor said, like, how can we move forward and how can we empower the students is probably the challenge for us. And then organizationally, unfortunately, I think because of the resource depletion, many organizations are kind of stepping back their effort that they have already started to take for diversity, inclusion, and equity. So, for example, the the fire department that I mentioned, they had to cut down the hours of the equity manager during this time. So that's another thing that I'm a little concerned about.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really good answer to that. Before we get to Seth Meyer's question, Lori had a comment here. It says, a few weeks ago, Governor Cuomo announced that New York State is launching a major research effort in the communities and neighborhoods of color where COVID has been prominent, and coordinating with faculty at SUNY Albany, really just showcasing this important role of having numerous actors involved. I'm going to go ahead and unmute Seth Meyer so he can ask his question, and then give some context about it, and then we'll go to Pooja's question. So 1 second, Seth, as I get my mouse to work. Okay, Seth, you should be unmuted.
Thanks. Let's see if we can get through this with a little bit of quiet from the peanut gallery, from the Simon right now. Seth Meyer from Bridgewater State University. So I do research on social equity, especially on LGBTQ issues. And one issue I'm coming across is really, how do we define social equity, and especially how do we define social equity in an appropriate cultural context? When we're looking at LGBTQ issues, for example, well, obviously I think that's a social equity issue. A lot of other people will say it's not, or will see social equity as, how do we keep places able to limit access to LGBTQ people. So I think that it's something that I've had trouble with and I've been trying to go around, but how do we create some sort of definition that's both inclusive and yet, I don't know, and not in some ways of some sort of ivory tower type thing. I don't know if that made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Can I take that?
Yeah.
Sure. Professor Myers, thank you so much for that insightful question. I will speak on this from a practical and professional perspective, and I believe that people that focus on social equity from one lens or just another are focusing on that lens. Focusing on the concept of social equity very narrowly, because what we do know, and many of the panelists and I have been involved in writing about these issues for many years now, and certainly LGBT issues, for example, LGBT Matters has been central to a lot of my writing, and I would challenge anyone to suggest that it is not a social equity concern. So, I don't want to take up too much of your time because I'm sure my colleagues would like to address this as well. But I just feel that it's like the work of diversity and inclusion. It's not just for people of color or women, it's for everyone. Everyone has a part to play. And it's the same thing with social equity. Any matter that has an unfair tinge to it is worthy of analysis by folks in the academy and even those folks on the ground doing the actual work for the community.
Yeah. Thank you. And if I can build on what Dr. Johnson just said, Dr. Meyer, I think, and I mentioned this in the slide and I didn't go into it, but one of the things that we're seeing in terms of the culture within the United States is there is greater support today when you look at public opinion polls for rights, whether that be for employment protections, in terms of marriage, in terms of foster care and adoption. You see a tremendous this shift that has taken place over time, the past 20, 30 years, where there's a lot of support today for the LGBTQ community. And one of the things that we know is that if somebody knows somebody within the community, they are more likely to be accepting over time, and they are more likely to generate support. And I think that that is critical as we move forward. And one of the things I'm looking at is what type of advocacy are we doing in terms of media advocacy to ensure that that continues to happen? because I think half the battle in ensuring that populations that have been marginalized or are vulnerable, that they obtain rights, legal rights, as well as federal funding and resources, is that we increase as much as possible public opinion and support. And I've seen people who have been opposed to individuals in the LGBTQ community, and after they got to know folks, they're like, oh yeah, this is a really good person, and I'm going to support them. And I think that is so critical that people know that. And what I would like to see is more media, whether that be in terms of public announcements, in terms of social media, whatever we need to do, billboards, etc., to put a face with the name and to move forward with that. And I think that's just critical in changing the culture within the United States in general and moving forward. But I think definitely when we perceive social equity, you're right, in a divided country politically and also culturally and religiously, we got to figure a way to move forward. But I have seen, in my own like Christian community, I have seen people change their opinions, and I have seen them move forward and advance and help people in LGBTQ. And it can be done. And I think that's important to note as we move forward.
I would just add that one of the things that's important for us to remember in public administration is that word public and the fact that we are charged with serving the public, which means everyone. And so when we are looking at those definitions of social equity and other things, we do need to make sure that they are inclusive and reflect that we are serving the public, as in all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. So what I'd like to do now, we have a couple more questions coming in. Dr. Patansu has a question. We also have Dr. Puja Paswan. I'm going to go with Dr. Paswan's question first, and we'll get to Dr. Patansu's question. Dr. Paswan notes that India saw a mass exodus of rural migrants forced to return without a mode of transport or money during the COVID lockdown. And I think this goes nicely into this where we've been going here. How does public administration ensure the most vulnerable who help build society are not left out?
Right, I took it last time, so I'm going to pass it to my colleagues. I don't want to start first again.
I can try. Well, it is a big topic, and this is an ongoing issue that I think we have all been trying to address. So my thought is to kind of, I don't like this word, but try to make a conscious effort to apply the equity lens. And so try to ask ourselves in every decisions we make, every policy that we make, we have to train ourselves as a public administrator to think about who is impacted adversely with this decision, who is left out in making this decision. And just by kind of raising the awareness, I think we may be able to come up with a better solution for the larger vulnerable population.
I would also like to add, I think we have to do things to make people or ensure that people have safe jobs, that the jobs they go to, whether that is, providing protective gear in terms of masks, that kind of thing, in terms of the immediate, what needs to be done to mitigate the crisis. And then secondly is ensuring, I think the first thing, oftentimes we make assumptions what people need, and we need to ask them specifically, what is it? Because what I hear from people and talking to them is they need affordable, safe daycare. They need to be able to, some folks are having to leave their kids at home because they don't have daycare or don't have access to it. And it's a real challenge for working families who are working minimum wage jobs. And so we have to come up with a way economically to help people because they are in the jobs, whether it be in the service industry, the hotels, the hospitality industry, or working in plants and manufacturing. We got to figure out a way to protect them. So I think having a safe job comes first and foremost, and also giving them access to affordable daycare. And, they gave out stimulus money. And I wonder, one, did everybody who was supposed to get it? And are they going to keep doing that to ensure that people can pay their bills, where they can make their mortgage payments, where they can come in and make their rent and not have to be afraid of becoming homeless or losing their cars or their transportation? There's a number of things we need to do, I think, in the country in terms of federal legislation, economically, to ensure that people are protected and they're helped. The numbers I'm seeing and reading, assuming they're accurate, we've got numbers here getting close to what they saw in the Great Depression when it comes to unemployment. And people are afraid economically, and they're scared, and they have every right to be. People are hurting, and we need to do everything economically, but also when it comes to public health, we have got to adequately fund public health. We need to do a better job in this country of taking care of our seniors who are in nursing homes and senior citizens to ensure that they're being well taken care of. We've known for years the problems and lack of staffing and resources that has taken place. And we just really got to step up in this country and make sure we protect vulnerable people.
I want to just jump in there after Dr. Naylor. I'm sorry, is everything, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just I think 1 second. Sorry, we're getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm just going to put on mute. Okay, try one more time, Dr. Johnson. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you, Dr. McCandless. I just wanted to piggyback on Dr. Naylor's point, and before I do that, I think I also want to mention the fact that she holds, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but Dr. Naylor holds a MPH, a Master's of Public Health, and in addition to her doctorate degree, of course. But so here we have someone that has actually studied these types of things, and I think when at all possible, we should acknowledge our experts and make sure that we're seeking their guidance, because this is what they've studied, this is what they do for a living. So Dr. Naylor, thank you for being in the healthcare profession and really taking that on. Greatly appreciate it. But also, I think what I would like to do is just in relation to the question is to make sure that we acknowledge, the people on this Zoom conference call, that we acknowledge our privilege, right? We are privileged to be doing what we're doing now and to be able to do it from the comfort of our home or wherever you are at this moment. Because if you're talking about individuals who are from marginalized communities and working minimum wage jobs, typically they don't have the luxury of doing what we're doing right now. They've got to go into work. So going back to Dr. Naylor's point, how do we ensure that those folks are protected? We have a situation whereby the governors across the country and also the leadership in the White House are wanting to reopen our society, which I believe that most of us think, is it the right time, right? Despite the fact that I'm sure we're all going stir crazy, right? I know I am here in San Francisco, but are we potentially harming those individuals who would essentially have to do the reopening? Those individuals that don't have the luxury of saying, well, let's wait another couple of weeks or so, because they've got to get out and they've got to make money. So I just say all of that to say that we've got to acknowledge our own privilege in this, right? And then from an equity perspective, decide how we can help to ensure that the most vulnerable populations are safe, especially when they go to work.
Mhm. Our four panelists, do you have time for one more question? And that wasn't it, but just one more question after this one. Okay. I would like to invite our wonderful social media editor, Parisa Vinzant, to ask the question, which I also love. You know, now that I'm a doctoral program associate director, I'm really interested in education. So please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our wonderful panelists and to our wonderful audience members. Really a fascinating, stimulating discussion is going on here. So I want to address this question to all of you or whoever would like to answer this question. But building off of something that Dr. Johnson said, he said that there are systemic issues that are causing such disproportionate and harmful mortality rates of African Americans to COVID-19. So when considering the dominant approach to teaching PA, how do we know that our graduates are capable and ready to lead in informal and formal leadership roles to specifically advance racial equity?
Wow.
You know, I'll just jump in and start. First of all, they're never going to be prepared if we don't actually talk about it, right? So part of it is just actually making sure that these issues around equity, systemic racism, all forms of equity are included in our curriculum and our teaching and the case studies we use and the questions we have in class, so that it becomes part, again, of just their regular thinking pattern of, okay, I'm going to look at this problem. What questions do I need to take into consideration? And one of them are the social equity aspects. And so for me, part of it is it has to be part of the curriculum. I mean, it has to be talked about. It's not going to happen for anyone if we aren't bringing it up in the classroom and raising the questions and reminding students. I talk about the pillars of public administration and the trade-off fund policy values and all of those kinds of things. And again, that's part of what I want to try to find out is it working? Is it making a difference? Are people paying more attention? But the start is it just has to be a regular part of the curriculum and the conversation, or no one's going to be able to be trained and have this be part of their normal operating procedures.
And if I could add too, you know, I think in addition to curriculum, like Dr. Norman-Major had said, is so critical because not all MPA programs have individual courses on social equity or diversity. Oftentimes it is under an umbrella course, say on public personnel administration. Now some universities do, some MPA programs certainly do that, and that's very necessary. And I think the other way too is we continue to offer not just training and education and courses, but also when we bring our MPA and doctoral students to ASPA and to social equity conferences and making sure they're a part of those discussions, presenting papers, being a part of those dialogues. Because I think that's how we train people. And then when they go into federal, state, and local service, they have been indoctrinated, if you will, into a culture and assimilation of inclusion and of social equity. And I think that's another piece of it. It's education that we formally do in classes, but also ensuring that our graduate students go to conferences, they go and hear and be a part of those dialogues that are taking place, and also to do research on it so they can see in quantifiable, measurable terms is that we have still got to focus on issues of race and to move forward. And the information is there. And I think when they present papers on it and they're surrounded by a professional network, by a professional group of colleagues who also support that makes a world of difference too. When they go into their jobs and, you know, they're in their careers for decades, that it's already a part of them, that they're assimilated into that. And I think that's just a really another important mechanism, if you will, in addition to what Kris just said about being a part of the curriculum within the field of public administration and public policy.
Yeah, so I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Masami. I was just going to piggyback on what Dr. Naylor and what Dr. Norman-Major both mentioned. First of all, such a fantastic question and so important. And I couldn't agree with my colleagues that spoke earlier. I couldn't agree more with them. They were spot on. Especially regarding the conferences. So for example, we have it, at least we had it in our MPA budget that we would take a certain amount of our MPA students to either ASPA or NASPA. So this year, NASPA and ASPA both were supposed to be on the West Coast. So therefore, that was an easier trip for us. And we were able to sponsor 12 to 14 students, MPA students, to go for the conferences. And of course, that didn't happen. But I do think that is so important. And it is, as Dr. Norman-Major just mentioned, the curriculum is such a big thing to make sure that they're getting this information on social equity within their classes. My concern is always, though, that for those programs that don't have a designated course, how are they measuring whether or not these topics are being taught? And I say that from my own experiences because the University of San Francisco, which is a university I love our program, but a number of my colleagues, at least a couple of years ago, would say that, we are teaching these topics of diversity and inclusion and fairness in all of our courses, but there's not necessarily a mechanism to measure that. And so that's concerning. I personally would rather see at least one designated course, and I know that's tough. Most of our MPA programs are packed already with things that the students have to take. But I would like to see, and what I would try to push in my own program is for at least one course where we can say, unequivocally that the students are getting this information so that at least when they leave, we can say they've had it. And I would push for it probably towards the end of the curriculum, though there's nothing wrong with having it at the beginning and at the middle. It's just so important. And finally, I would add that making sure that the students understand their own biases, right? We all have biases, but teaching about implicit biases is really, I think, goes a step further than just social equity issues, because, you could have the well-meaning, well-intentioned person in the world, but if they're coming to the table with all of these biases that may negatively impact someone, like the public, then that's an issue. So that's all that I would have. I could say more, but I'll stop my comments right there and let Dr. Masami, who graciously let me jump in front of her. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Masami.
No problem, because then I can build on your comment. And what Dr. Johnson mentioned reminded me that in our program at Portland State, a few years ago, we decided that we will make it a requirement that at least one of the courses that they take during the time they spend in our program, at least one has to be diversity, equity, and in social equity inclusion related course. So we identify several of those courses, not just from our department, but from other departments included, that addresses and touch on those topics, and we made it as a requirement. And that we don't quite know what the actual outcome is, but at least I am seeing that everybody is at least exposed to this topic. And I think that is a good thing. I'm also rereading the question and that says, how do we know that our graduates are capable and ready to read? And I was thinking, I'm always not quite sure whether they are capable and they are ready. But I think I can see in our graduates that they have a right mindset and right attitude and have a potential to be a great leader. And to do that, we also try to help them have the right tool. Not just the right tool to do things, but just like Dr. Johnson said, the right tool to assess themselves and assess the environment, assess the situation, and then come up with a way to move forward. And so at least that's how I do my best and try to kind of help them be able to lead and advance racial equity.
Thank you all. I really do appreciate all of your really, deep, insightful, and varied responses. So I'll hand it back to you, Sean.
All right. Well, I just want to give a thanks to everyone who attended, everyone listening. This webinar is going to have a second life as a recording on our social media and YouTube, and I'm already going to be using it in my classes in the fall, so you're going to have an audience of at least 60 more asynchronously. So just thank you to Dr. Johnson, Dr. Naylor, Dr. Nishishiba, Dr. Norman-Major, and thanks to our social media, wonderful social media person, Parisa Vinzant, who's been absolutely instrumental in promoting the work of the section, raising awareness on and really taking substantive action on advancing democracy and social justice at multiple levels. We hope to see you at our next webinar jointly held with NASPA's Diversity and Social Equity Committee on June 4th, 3 to 4:30 p.m. It looks like Parisa has already shared the RSVP list. Please be sure to RSVP for that. We have a great group of panelists. Again, we'll be sharing this on social media, but we're going to be running by an edited recording first with our panelists before sharing it. And as we close, just my last thing, I just really like to reiterate what the section on democracy and social justice stands for. And this idea that DSJ's in treaty is that we should be sure to remember to embody these principles on which we're based, namely being sure to promote fairness, equity, justice, respect, and mutual benefit for everyone, and that we have duties at the personal, interpersonal, group, organizational, systemic, and societal levels to promote democracy and social justice. So thank you all for attending, and take care. Have a great remainder to your Friday weekend, and just stay safe.